thank you, Dr. Bryant-Davis, for your lecture, but even more so for a concrete demonstration of what embodied spirituality and healing looks like. I know we talk about mind, body, and spirit, but that's what it looks like. And I think, in theology, we talk about, James K. Smith talks about how often that how we think about spiritual formation and spiritual life. In that sense, we think about people as brains on sticks. It's like we give you information and then you will be fully transformed. How is that possible? I want to personally thank you for your invitation for all of us to connect deeply with ourselves, to fully own all of ourselves, our bodies, our emotions, our traumas, and healing in the midst of trauma. So thank you so much for that. I thought about what it means for me to own my Asian American male body with all of its difficulties, traumas, and also its privilege as well. I also want to express gratitude during this Black History Month to the many Black voices, men and women, communities, organizations that have borne the brunt of the burden of addressing race in the U.S., and in so many ways have been forerunners. Asian American movements, Asian American studies, and Asian American psychology have a profound debt of gratitude and benefited so much from these Black voices, and have stood in a long history of solidarity with Black communities. And that history often is lost to some, but it's something that I try to kind of recover for myself and for my students as well. One of the things I tell my students, especially Asian American students, is to take yourself seriously. To take yourself seriously. It's such an odd way of talking about it as Christians, to take yourself seriously. And I say, well, look, you have heard so many voices that have said who you are, what your body is. You don't even know what your history is. You don't even know what your culture is. You talk about Confucianism, you thought it was a fortune cookie. Confucianism is over 2,000 years old. Have you studied that? How do you have the gumption to critique something when you know nothing about it? How do you take yourself seriously? How do you take your history seriously? How do you take your questions and the issues seriously? As you know, different communities of color obviously experience, navigate race differently. Even as we all suffer from its burdens, there are particular challenges of being Asian American. And the Asian American community has its own versions of microaggressions and systemic racism and cultural negotiations, as well as our gifts and our communities of wise, strong Asian American women as well. In the midst of all this, and as I've been enjoying these lectures, I've been thinking about what a long and arduous journey it has been for me, and it still is, for me to detox from the racist Orientalism that I've absorbed within our society. It is just so difficult for me to think about my heritage and myself as something positive without just pathologizing the heck out of just everything that's Asian American. I get fixated sometimes. I'm like, whoa, that's Asian race, Asian shame, right? Oh, that's how our culture is, and everything negative. And I've absorbed these messages, and it's very difficult to kind of sort through this thing. Just this week, as I was teaching, I had to confess to the class in my class on Asian American identity and ministry, and saying, this is a long journey for me. Because I see it. When I interact with the students, I hear this negativity. Even as we've learned so much about internalized racism and everything else, I still hear so much negativity of saying, well, this is our Asian culture. It's so bad. But the white culture is perfect. I'm thinking, what white culture have you seen? Right? So you see the worst of yourself and the best of this? Like, how is that possible? Well, this is basically what we've absorbed. And sometimes being more educated doesn't help us if the education isn't decolonized, right? This is where the wisdom of the Womanist Psychology that Dr. Bryant-Davis shared with us is so insightful. And I want to kind of point out a couple of things that I think, and as a theologian, I want to point out a couple of things. One of the lessons of womanism is that we must recover our whole selves. And this insight of intersectionality has profoundly impacted how we think about identities, how we think about privileges and powers, right? That there's multiple selves, that there are multiple dimensions of ourselves. There's multiple dimensions of power dynamics. As a theologian, I think about how it's impacted how I think about our social identities. And I want to kind of give you some images in terms of how often we think about our Christian identity as it relates to social identities. Let me see if this works here. All right, here you go. All right, so, because I love these little charts. So we have our Christian identity, and then we have our racial, ethnic, cultural, gender, and then, so on, right? All the different social, earthly, human identities. How do these identities relate? Because I think that's fundamentally part of what the problem is. How do we relate these two together? Now, one way of relating them is to say, well, look, Christian identity is among other human identities. I am Asian American, I'm male, I am, American, I am, whatever, middle class, professor, whatever. Along with that, I'm Christian. And as you can see, you can think about Christian identity as just another social affiliation. And all of us can see the fact that this is not theologically adequate, right? Belonging to Christ is not one thing among many, right? So we say that is not it. Here's another version of it, right? Christian identity under social identities. I mean, I think in positively, humanistically speaking, we can say, well, we're all human and religion shouldn't divide us. That's how some people talk about it. Or another way of thinking about it, we can say, well, look, maybe instead of kind of a generous humanism, we can have a very narrow sectarianism. Maybe I am male or I am Asian before I am Christian. And you say, wait a minute, that's very problematic, right? So given that and how they can lead to idolatry, we say the solution is the fact that Christian identity is over social identities, where Christ over all things, that we are aliens and strangers. And this is what it means. So we say, instead of your whatever social identities you have, you should put your Christian identity first. And it looks good. It looks pretty good, right? And pastors like to say, this is basically what it means. I think for people who actually suffer a lot from their social identities, this sounds like such a dream, right? I didn't like being Asian American anyway. So I'm a child of God, right? I didn't like skin color anyway, so I'll be a child of God, right? It sounds so good. It sounds so seductive. But have you seen a Christian who doesn't embody the whole bodies? Can we be in Christ without our bodies? Right? It sounds so good. And you see popular posts, right? On Facebook, because that's where I get all my theological knowledge from. They say, oh, being a Christian, Christ above all. Now, the problem is, it assumes the fact that you can be a Christian as an abstract human being. Have you ever met an abstract human being? This is a deep theological problem, and it comes from our creeds, actually, the Chalcedonian Creed. Christ being fully human and fully divine. But what kind of a human? Oh, it doesn't say. Just fully human. Abstract human. Have you ever met an abstract human? No. It ignores the fact, and this comes at a particular time in Christianity, in church history, where they erased the Judaism roots, right? The Jewish roots of Christianity, right? And we have a long history of that. So what ended up happening was, instead of having a Jewish first century Palestinian Jew Christ, we have a basic human Christ. And that is fundamentally where our problem lies. Instead of being like this, it should be like this. Christian identity in and through our social identities. All of who I am have to be in Christ, because, as you know, Christ resurrected as a Jewish man. Yes. Right? It's not like Peter was like, oh, Jesus, you're white. I mean, right? It wasn't a shock to them. Like, I mean, Jesus was a Jewish man, right? And we totally erase this idea, even though it's all over the Bible, right? So that's the first insight. I think the second insight is decolonizing is just as helpful for people who are seemingly normative. I want you to look at this painting here. This is a creation of Adam by Michelangelo. And, all of you are so familiar with this thing. Now, there is, and I'm going to give you a different version of this painting here. So here is humanity, here is God, right? This is a creation of God by Monia Rosares. She's an Afro-Cuban American artist. Now, when I first saw this, I was offended. I was like, what? Can you do that? Right? That's not right. Why does a black woman get to represent all humanity? Wait a minute. Why did a white man get to represent all humanity? Why did we not see that? Why did I not see that before? Right? So in this sense, decolonizing helps people who are normative to see themselves. And that seeing is important. That seeing is important. That's one of the reasons why, I've loved this book, History of White People by Nell Irvin Painter. She's a Princeton historian. And I was like, well, history of white people, isn't that just history? No, it turns out people who are white don't understand the fact that there's a history of whiteness, right? Because they were normalized, that was all invisible. And seeing that, you realize, wow, that is really, really helpful, right? For normalized people to particularize themselves, to see themselves, what an insight that is. In missional theology, it talks about the fact that when churches didn't realize the fact that North America was a context, we were totally blind to all the cultural corruptions. Only when we could see ourselves can we be free from all the captivities, cultural captivities and co-option that happens. In some sense, decolonizing helps everybody, right? Especially the people who are normalized. With that, because my time's up, I want to just end with this one question. And it's a question about, we've talked a lot in these lectures about, the church, the problems of the church, right? And what I wanted to ask was, Dr. Bryant-Davis, what are the ways that we can foster a community, especially church community, that integrates mental health and activism? We talked about a lot of us individually of this thing, but what are the languages, practices, and formation processes that can nurture a community of embodied spiritual and holistic health, as well as activism as well? So thank you.